Cannabis is a real old topic, and the cannabis plant developed about 31 million years ago, and it was preceded by the development of the endocannabinoid system in animals by many hundreds of millions of years. Your endocannabinoid system, the regulatory system in the body, developed 600 million years ago in the sea, and is present in every animal above a sea sponge. And humans discovered cannabis at least 12,000 years ago. The proof for that is in Formosa with pottery that was wound with a rope that was made from hemp. And hemp fiber might have preceded using hemp for religious and spiritual purposes, maybe not. But then in India, it became very, very much used for thousands of years, and was probably one of the ingredients in soma. The first scriptures were the Vedic scriptures, and the Rig Veda was the first one. And in the Rig Veda, the first scriptures written by humans, it started out as praise to soma. Soma was a plant, and soma was God. And some people think soma was cannabis, some people think soma was the fly agaric mushroom, but most real scientists think that soma was a combination of cannabis, the poppy, and the stimulant, the ephedra, together. That was the soma, that was the beginning of scripture, human scripture. And so you notice that when the Hebrews had to start their own scripture, the first thing they did was to say that this kind of illumination from plants was bad and evil and wrong and forbidden. And just about the first thing in the Bible is the forbidden fruit, and you shall not eat the forbidden fruit. And the astounding reason is that the forbidden fruit will give you the knowledge of good and evil, and you should not have that? Now that is pretty blindingly stupid. And right now, in this day and age, there's nothing more we need than the knowledge of good and evil. And alcohol and opiates don't provide you with the knowledge of good and evil. And the teaching plants like marijuana and psilocybin or peyote, etc., do teach you the knowledge of good and evil and tell you better be a good person yourself, and tend to make you a lot more sensitive to nature and spirituality. Getting back to cannabis, it was very commonly used in India, both for spiritual and just general social purposes. The drink called bhang, B-H-A-N-G, was used culturally by everyone in the society for many, many centuries or millennia, and it's a milk drink with spices in it and usually just leaf cannabis. But it certainly did lubricate social interaction and made everybody happy and worked out fine. The history of real religion on earth, my favorite author, Jonathan Ott, divides into three periods. There is the age of entheogens, where everyone used plants to gain illumination, which lasted right up until the end of the Mysteries of Eleusis in 1495. That's when the Christians cracked down. That's when they said you can't have any more secret societies and you can't have any more special plants that you get illumination from. And so from this period, from about 495 AD, you can see how civilization just disintegrated, dropped into the dark ages of ignorance and filth. And only later on did tend to regenerate itself. The Islamic countries during that period of the Dark Ages did stick with hashish and learning as well. And the hashish didn't seem to bother the learning. But they did have an Islamic purge, very much like the situation in the 60s in the United States. In the 13th century in Egypt, the Sufis started to get a little bit too loose and relax and have too much sex and not enough hard work. And the quotes from the 13th century religious figures in Egypt are almost exactly the same as from the 60s in America about these lazy hippies who are enjoying themselves too much. The story about the Chinese shaman in the 2nd century BC is really fascinating, because here was a man who was dug up in pretty much the situation where he died. He was carrying a pouch, and the pouch had bud, and it was not just plain bud gathered from a wild plant. It was sensimilla bud that had been planted and cultivated and clipped as sensimilla, as seedless pot, almost 5,000 years ago. So they were very sophisticated in their use of marijuana 5,000 years ago. And it's really important to understand that medicine has had very few things to work with up until the last 100 years. And that cannabis, especially since it cured and helped with so many different things, was an indispensable part of the toolbox of any physician all over the world for so long, and was part of every pharmacopoeia from ancient China, done by Shen Nung in 2300 BC, through the pharmacopoeias of India and Iran and Europe. Cannabis is always there in ancient times. And for them to say now that it's not safe or not useful is absurd beyond belief. When you take your first couple of puffs of cannabis, you get this wonderful, relaxed feeling, almost beatific feeling of happiness, joy, relaxation, and your first thought is, what in the world? How could this be illegal? Why is cannabis really illegal? It's illegal for basically 4 reasons. I read for about 25 or 30 years before I became an activist to try to really figure this out. The first reason really is industrial conspiracy. A lot of people don't believe this, but it is true. And it was basically centered on the DuPont Corporation. And the DuPont Corporation had the patents for both the chemicals used to make paper out of trees and nylon, the super fiber. And hemp was going to replace paper for trees and replace most kinds of fiber. And you know that nothing passes the legislature just on the day it was first thought of. It has to go through committee for a long time. Someone has to carry it through committee. And the DuPont Corporation carried it through committee from 1935 to 1937 and got it all ready to go on the floor, where it was passed immediately with almost no discussion. The American Medical Association was never notified, and they were absolutely furious. So the first reason is, yes, the competition of hemp was too much, and they got rid of that competition. And in doing that, they wiped out the medical benefits as well. The second reason, obviously, is racism. It is racism against black people. One of Harry Anslinger's favorite projects one day is that he was going to round up every major jazz musician in America, all the big names that you know. And he sent this memo to his boss that he was planning to Count Basie and Duke Ellington and Charlie Mingus, and he was just going to round them all up as an example. And he received a memo back, a forward memo from his boss saying, this is not advised. No, they didn't want him to go after everything. But that racism was so deep. Black women were white women were going to be raped by blacks, and it's really critical also to remember that it was racism against Mexicans that was a big part of it. We're talking about the 30s. The 30s was a deep depression. Many people were thinking that capitalism was just going to die completely. And there were all these Mexicans in the United States whose labor had been very important before, but now, by the mid-30s, American workers wanted them out because they perceived them as competition. So, what could they use to get them out? They could use their love of cannabis, make up crazy stories about how Mexicans killed everybody when they got under the influence of cannabis, and that racism against blacks and Mexicans going crazy and creating crime was the second biggest reason for cannabis being made illegal. And the third real biggie was the bureaucratic imperative. The Department of Narcotics was set up, and in 1933, Prohibition ended. We were in the middle of great budget pressure on the federal government. Their department was ready to be zeroed out. And so, even though Harry Anslinger in 1929 or 30 said, it's absurd to think about banning cannabis. Cannabis grows like dandelions anywhere. You couldn't possibly ban cannabis. But when the Depression really hit and his department was in danger of being zeroed out in 34, they decided that cannabis was the assassin of youth and that it led to inevitable murder, insanity, and death. And this was going to be their new campaign. So Harry Anslinger and the Department of Narcotics planted articles in all the magazines in the U.S., and then they used those articles that they had planted as evidence in their testimony before Congress. They never had any sort of science connected with it at all, and if any science did happen, like the LaGuardia Commission in New York City that found out there was nothing wrong with cannabis in 1944, Harry Anslinger threatened to throw the doctors in jail if they ever actually studied the situation. And the fourth reason cannabis is illegal is the American vestiges of Puritanism. We really are still a deeply Puritan country. Pleasure is something to fear. And it comes to mind the great H.L. Mencken quote from the 30s about the definition of Puritanism. Puritanism is the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, might be having fun. And this is the fourth aspect of it. With alcohol, it carries its own revenge. It carries its own difficulty. You have a great hangover the next day. But this concept that you can smoke marijuana and have pleasure and then have no suffering following it, well, that's pretty subversive and definitely a reason it should be outlawed. So those are the four big reasons: industrial conspiracy, racism, bureaucratic imperative, and the fear of pleasure. And I think that now we've got data, we can see all these things are false, we're not supposed to be racist anymore, and I think it's clearly time for reasons of personal freedom and reasons of revenue, and now reasons of spirituality and religion and saving the planet, that I think we've got to legalize cannabis. The environmental movement didn't really start until after people had started using cannabis. Is it just correlation or is there causation? Cannabis makes you feel more deeply about many things, and it really makes you feel more deeply about nature. And when you can sense the destruction of nature, it does not make you feel good. It makes you feel like part of yourself is being destroyed. And I truly believe that the integration of cannabis and all the teaching plants into culture is the only thing anymore that could possibly save civilization. It seems absurd. However, now we can look and see that data, logic, reason, truth doesn't mean anything anymore. And Einstein said so categorically, Albert Einstein said, no problem can be solved. No problem can be solved from the level of consciousness that created it. And I truly think at this point, consciousness politics becomes absolutely critical, because we have not changed our consciousness at all. We are going to run our beautiful golden goose of the earth right into the ground. And I think the consciousness that the plant world can bring to us can help us adapt our civilization in order to save the earth and let humanity have a decent way to live.
Nice.
Thanks.